Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here on this cold, dreary Michigan, typical Michigan winter day. It is our last Eye on Africa for this semester. We've had a very successful semester with our year of Global Africa, and so we have a distinguished visitor that I'll introduce in a second, who will be our final presenter for this semester. Of course, I'll make an announcement in a minute about our first speaker next semester on January 17th. But just a few announcements before I introduce the speaker. First of all, for graduate students and undergraduates interested in our FLAS scholarship program, our African language program, there are flyers back here. And if you don't know, if you're an undergraduate and or a graduate student and don't know about the FLAS program, it's a little bit too complicated to talk about it right now, but pick up a flyer. There's flyers back there, and you can contact the African Studies Center for more information about it. But it's a wonderful fellowship to learn African languages here on campus that pays for most of your tuition and provides a stipend as well. So please check that out. Also, Shingi brought up, thank you Shingi, a flyer for that has all of the study abroad, education abroad. I'm used to it. I've worked for 32 years in doing study abroad, and it was called Study Abroad. Now, this year it's Education Abroad. There are programs, many good programs in Africa. Please look it over. It's not too late. March 1st is the deadline for study abroad, education abroad programs. And then the third announcement has to do with our distinguished visitor, distinguished scholar in residence that's going to be here as part of the Year of Global Africa for January and February of next year. A very, very famous human rights lawyer from South Africa, Albie Sachs, will be teaching a one-credit course. Those of you who have been attending the Eye on Africa have heard about this before. The information is on here. It's open to all graduate students and to undergraduates who are in the Honors College, irregardless of their disciplinary background, and of course law school students, because he will be in residence at the law school. But more directly related to the Eye on Africa, he will be our presenter at the first Eye on Africa in the new year on January 17th. So even if you're coming because you're required to come as a class, please come back for that. I can guarantee you. He got an honorary doctor's degree at our May graduation this last year, and everybody that was honored to interact with him was totally wowed by his personality and more importantly, the personal story that he shared about his incredible life in support of justice in South Africa. Okay, having said that, let me introduce our final speaker for this semester. James Ocita is as a lecturer, a professor at Makerere University in Uganda, one of the really distinguished institutions of higher learning in Africa, one of the earliest universities in the earliest university in English-speaking East Africa. He has a PhD from the Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and he has a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Maryland, a master's degree, and his undergraduate degree from Makerere University, where he is now. He's going to be speaking to us today related to his interest in research on diaspora literature, diaspora identity, the unhomely, and politics of belonging in Indian East African novels. So James, thank you very much for being with us, and welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you all for coming. I'm very delighted to be here at MSU. When I was awarded ASA African Studies Association Presidential Fellowship, I was given the option of choosing an American institution to host me, and I took a while doing that. And by the time I made a move, after having done a few searches here and there, I actually settled for MSU. And so I wrote back to the African Humanities Program, which was coordinating African Humanities Program and African Studies Association, which was coordinating my fellowship. It so happened by coincidence that 2 weeks before I wrote, MSU had actually expressed interest in hosting me. So I think I'm so glad, because this is my presence here is by mutual interest. So I'm delighted. My paper is from a broader book monograph that I'm currently working on. I started working on this as an extension of my doctoral project, and it's also the project that I did for my African Humanities postdoctoral project. So the broader work is on the question of diaspora identity, where I look at questions of memory and cultural identity and negotiations of belonging, with a focus in East Africa and South Africa. So the paper that I'm presenting here is part of my core chapters, and it has an East African theme. So in my presentation, I will try to contextualize my presentation within my broader research, and I'll briefly say something about the theoretical and critical approaches that inform my paper, particularly this presentation. Then I'll say something about the texts that I'm using, the primary texts, and the context of their production. And finally, I'll end with an analysis of the engagements between Asians and East Africans and East Africa. Throughout, I'll be using the term Asians as an analytical category, and normally that is the politically correct term that we use in East Africa, but otherwise the more precise and maybe a term that easily lends itself to the wider audience is Indians. In East Africa, we tend to use Asians in recognition of the politics that happened in the mid-20th century, especially with the partition, where British colonial India was partitioned into the present-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and also a group that is a big part of that, especially with regard to Uganda, are the Goans. So by way of contextualizing this paper, I want to talk about the origins of Indians in East Africa and South Africa. They make their first arrival in South Africa in 1860 as part of the indentured labor system, which was introduced to fill in the gap that was left following the abolition of slavery. And in East Africa, there was also an indentured labor system that was put in force in the close of the 19th century. In both locations, the arrival of indentured laborers were followed almost simultaneously by the influx of voluntary, free-paying Asians, more or less like the kind of patterns of immigration that we see today. So the register of passenger Indians, however, resonates more with the South African context, even though the same phenomena that is described as passenger Indian migration is also a big part of the influx in East Africa. Actually, in East Africa, the arrival of Indians way predate British colonialism in the region, even though British colonialism led to a march to an upsurge in that wave of migration. So the simultaneous arrival of these indentured laborers and passenger Indians is what is responsible for the presence of the diasporas, the Asian or Indian diasporas in the two locations. And in my presentation, in my broader research, I try to see how their presence in East Africa, their performance of cultural identity is complicated by colonialism, British colonialism in the area with whom Asians were seen to be associated, their orientation both towards the subcontinent and towards Britain, and their insular identity, and so on and so forth. All of these complicate notions of belonging, notions of citizenship, as I explore. So in both locations, I make mention of the fact that their association with colonialism, apartheid, and coupled with their perceived social insularity, have exacerbated their perception and treatment as anomalous transnational or diaspora communities, with their multiple attachments and orientation and questionable loyalty being a further complicating factor in their identity and desires for belonging. Thus, they are perceived widely as an alien presence and a threat to national cohesion. Equally disconcerting has been the homogenizing tendencies of the host national people to ignore the fractured identities among Indians, further exacerbating sense of cultural loss and therefore the need to police cultural identity among the group. Against this condition, writers of Indian descent in the two locations have responded with counter-narratives that articulate experiences of the unhomely and assert cultural particularities as part of the challenges of inhabiting the present. The thesis of my broader work is that the representations of the unhomely, which I deploy here in Omi Baba's sense as the disorienting effects of relocation of home in the aftermath of migration, makes an ever-present dilemma of the urgency to strike a balance between claims of belonging and the desire for specific cultural identities. Treating the severance from the diaspora center in the Indian subcontinent as a form of dismemberment, I read the various modes of cultural significations represented in Indian narratives from East Africa and South Africa as processes of remembering with hyphen, of retracing lost or threatened connections to the place of origin, while simultaneously forging new affiliations with the host nation states. I advance this argument to show how Indian narratives complicate homogenizing tendencies that invariably obscure fractures within Indianness and challenge its totalizing claims to reveal contestations that take place within cultures. In my monograph, I pursue this argument in 5 core chapters. And in the first chapter, I try to yoke the two regions by focusing on the pioneering narratives from East Africa and South Africa. The one from South Africa is published in 1960, which is a very important date. And the one from East Africa is published in 1971, again, a very important date, given that 1971 is just a year before the expulsion of Asians in 1972. The publication dates of this work mark, in the context of South Africa, the launching of Umkhonto weSizwe, that is the armed wing of African National Congress, and the climax of Africanization politics in East Africa, which is conceived as part of the far-reaching decolonization process in East Africa. Each of these novels deploy utopianism as a suitable model for projecting vision of interracial harmony and a model of post-independent citizenship or post-apartheid citizenship that embrace Indians as free citizens of the emerging nation states. For Singh and Tijani, the authors of these pioneering novels, the utopian emerges as an intercultural site for richer cultural signification and interracial engagement. The social visions that the two novelists project indict contemporary social realities against which their novels situate themselves. So in the second part, which is what I'm going to present on, I look at narratives that explore Indians' participation in nation building, especially in the immediate aftermath of independence. And this is narrated particularly as a response to the kind of nationalist discourses that project Indians as an anomalous presence in the regions. In the third chapter, I focus on narratives from South Africa, specifically post-apartheid narrative. And here I look at 2 short story collections and an autobiography. This particularly affirms genres that dominate apartheid era in South Africa. And there are arguments that are made that the nature of their genre lend themselves, the nature of these genres, so that is the short story and autobiography, lend themselves to the kind of intellectual work that was needed as part of the anti-apartheid struggle. In the fourth chapter, I return to still South Africa, where I look more specifically at narratives, 3 novels that are emerging in the post-apartheid moment. And especially these are narratives that are more invested in questions of roots and retracing of routes. And particularly they are activated by the post-apartheid ideology of the Rainbow Nation. So I look at how these novels go back to the celebration of cultural identity as part of the challenges of inhabiting the post-apartheid South African present. Then lastly, I focus on works that are emerging from East Africa, all of them by female writers, and all of them narrated from exile. So I'm more interested in the way exilic condition determines the vision of the images of Africa that is created. This work tend to be a lot more critical of Indian presence in the region. And so I try to make an account for the kind of stance that these authors who are writing from the UK, why they adopt that stance. So I want to make some critical observations before I embark on my paper. The first is my rationale for juxtaposing East Africa, which is more of a region, and South Africa, which is a country. I do this in recognition of what I'm calling East Africa as a site for the confluence of African, Asian, and European cultural streams. East Africa is used here as a near synonym with what I also call the Western Indian world, which refers to the East African coast and its hinterland viewed as a cohesive regional entity defined by coordinated pre-colonial maritime activities and greater cultural activities fostered by British colonialism in the region. The region that I'm calling East Africa, or the Indian Ocean world, was later forged into British East Africa and subsequently into the post-independent nation states of Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. The second point I want to make is pertains to the periodization, particularly with respect to East Africa, especially given the publication dates of my primary text. And this I see as occupying the midpoint in the periodization of my broader work. The first part of the periodization is what I think of as the pioneering moment when Indians are beginning to write back to dominant narratives that are coming from nationalist ideologies. And so 1972, which is the year of the publication of Peter Nazareth's In a Brown Mantle, as I said, coincides with the year of the expulsion of Asians from Uganda. But there are a culmination of events that lead up to this moment, as I'm going to show in a while. In 1989, which is the year of the publication of Vasanji's The Ganisak, marks the year of the return of expropriated properties by the new regime of President Museveni in Uganda. That particular moment, that particular gesture of returning the property of expropriated Asian is a big statement in the nation state's desire to forge a more amicable relationship with the Indian or Asian diaspora in the region. And both of these narratives are in significant ways responding to Bahadur Tejani's 1971 Day After Tomorrow, which is the pioneering novel that I've referenced before. So the writers are writing at a fraught moment at the height of Africanization politics, which by 1960 was characterized by a wave of Asian exodus from East Africa. And in response to that, Bahadur Tejani makes a desperate plea for the acceptance of Asians as bona fide East Africans, showcasing through romance their dedication to the cause of national integration. Vasanji and Nazareth depart markedly from and complicate Tajani's utopian vision of national integration for grounding instead the dystopian outcome of anti-colonial struggle and immediate post-independence nation building, particularly the ideals of national integration. So by way of partition, the paper in its broad sense has three thematic sections. In the first section, I deal with the transition from the Western Indian Ocean world to the post-independent nation state, which actually is emplotted in the plots of these two narratives, and therefore a very important element of the fabric of the narrative. These transitions, including that of the transition from colonialism to post-independence, produce new diasporas in the West, which continue to have complex relationship with the old diaspora in East Africa. And so I talk about the way that happens and why it's particularly important for understanding the character of this diaspora. The second part is explores the experience of migration and the complex affiliations that result from it, complicating questions of belonging, citizenship, especially in the post-independence dispensation. The third, which is what I'm going to focus on in my presentation, is where I return to the plotting of the two novels, which I read as presenting a search for a workable model of positive Afro-Asian engagements. I conclude that Asian victimization in the wake of the immediate post-independence nationalist favor stems less from popular perception of them as vestiges of imperialism, and more from their perceived failure to adjust to the pressures and demands of the post-independence dispensation. So this is what my presentation will focus on. But I want to first of all touch on the theoretical and critical approaches that I use. First of all, as I said, I read these novels as responding to Tajani's pioneering intervention. Even though both novelists continue with Tajani's approach of imagining national integration through romance, which thus enjoins us to read them as national allegories, the characters that they imagine represent significantly different options for relating to the nation state. Options that are cognizant of the local historical and political realities against which the novels are situated. The novel's placement at the midpoint of the periodization described above, that is between Tajani's pioneering engagement with the unwieldy question of national integration and the later post-1990 narratives emerging from imperial metropolises, recognizes that while the novel's narrative reach, that is the farthest point reached in the narrating moment, is conditioned by experiences of exile, the overwhelming bulk of the narrated moment is located in and grappled with East Africa, that is local realities. The emphasis that I place on the local here is meant not to deny the local's contiguity with the global, but rather to reorient it as a site from which the global dimensions of the narrative can be more productively teased out. Such an approach involves interrogating the interplay of genre and contemporaneity, a simultaneous focus on the narrating present, which illuminates the orienting consciousness as a vantage point, a point of view from which not only is memory constituted, but also which in fact is definitive of the novelistic discourse. The here and now of the novelistic discourse, the lived quotidian textures of experience, is ironically a form of critical disengagement with the present. For the present that novelistic discourse construct is one that is tentative and constantly in the process of becoming, and thus never will, as Bakhtin reminds us. Such a present contrasts diametrically with the immutable, unreachable past of epic narratives. I draw largely on Bakhtinian notion of the chronotope as a productive way of engaging with diaspora identity, the unhomely, and the politics of belonging in Asian East African narratives that are focused. The chronotope, literally time-space, defines, quote, the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature, unquote. Chronotopic analysis is a useful way of making sense of the contemporaneity or the quotidian which Bakhtin rightly emphasizes as the very object of representation in the novel. In Asian East African novels in which mobility is a central trope, displacement and relocation functions as poles of employment that frame the process of homemaking or homelessness and relocations of home in the aftermath of dislocation. Mobility thus emerges in these narratives as exemplars of chronotopic experience. Mobility is characteristically spatio-temporal. It is a movement through an experience of space and time, and overdetermined by a set of expectations, attitudes, and orientations of various diasporic or migrant subjects. I want to say something about the text, and particularly the context of their literal production, which I think is very important in the kind of analysis that I take. The novels focus, as with several others written by Asian East African writers, plot complex web of mobility exchange and transnational affiliations that unfold against the backdrop of the transition from colonialism to political independence and the subsequent disintegration of the region into postcolonial nation states. This transition brings with it new regimes of citizenship and belonging, displacing all forms of migrancy and settlership as extensive and untrammeled transoceanic cross-border movements, especially under colonialism, give way to greater border controls under the new dispensation. The complex web of mobility exchange and transnational affiliations that unfold against the backdrop of this transition complicate notions of home and national belonging. The political backlashes that follow the transition from colonialism to political independence, the disintegration of the Western Indian Ocean world into nation states, and Asians' subsequent exodus to destinations outside of East Africa, specifically in the UK, US, Canada, and Australia, produce what Vijay Mishra call old and new diasporas, which as product of mercantile capitalism and colonialism, and subsequently of later post-colonial migrations from the colonies, especially in the 1960s onward, further complicate questions of diaspora identity, and give us a very distinct way of understanding the different locations, one in the post-colony, the other in the imperial metropolises, that diaspora subjects navigate. The subjects of the whole diaspora in the colonial or post-colonial spaces that they occupy are implicated in complex relationship with other colonized peoples, while those in the new diaspora, having entered the metropolises of the empire or other white settler countries, negotiate their subjecthood with other marginal subjects who are living in these spaces. And the kind of engagement that they are engaged with, that they are involved in, is of course very different from that which take place in the post-colonies. My exploration in this chapter, however, will confine itself to the old diaspora, with my interest in the new diaspora extending wholly insofar as it illuminates the old diaspora. Representation of these processes in Vasanji's and Nazareth's novel foreground the nation as a site where nationalist politics and diaspora consciousness jostle for the determination of Asians' subjecthood and legitimacy in the emerging post-independence nation states. Representing cultural tensions between diaspora identities and post-colonial citizenship, Nazareth and Vasanji reminds us that Asian identity in East Africa is structured by the rift between filiation and affiliation, which, as Wena Solos argues in his reading of modern identity, has more to do with the fact of being a minority than with ancestral origins. Such a narrative stance is defined by commitment to the present, which then determines the orientation to the past and anticipation of the future. Theories such as George Lukács and Simon Lewis argue that the novel as a genre expresses modern homelessness, but in African literature, such homelessness is regretted as unfortunate. Notable exceptions are works such as V.S. Naipaul's A Bend in the River set in a war-ravaged town in the interior of the continent, which, though unnamed, appears to be Kisangani. Naipaul writes about an Indian in Africa for whom belonging is never treated as an ideal. A significant point to be made here, which highlights the point that I'm grappling with, is that perhaps Naipaul's novel, unlike that of Nazareth and Vasanji, could never be considered African, even though it's set in Africa. Published in 1972, In a Brown Mantle is remarkable for its accurate prediction of a means expulsion of Asians and the coup that ousted Obote from power. Emerging a year after Day After Tomorrow, at the height of Africanization, the novel complicates Tijani's plea for the recognition of Asians, offering instead a workable model of post-colonial citizenship based on evident investment in nation building. Nazareth emphasizes a separate Goan identity in an implicit rejection of the homogenizing Indian category. Against the common stereotypes of Indians as a group of exploiters, he underlines Goan's history of dedication to civil service rather than in the economy, as is the case of Indians. A second-generation migrant, his father having come from Goan to work for the British civil service. Nazareth's Goan characters share similar experience with those of the authors, and the trajectories that are mapped in this novel kind of fit almost perfectly with that of Nazareth himself. The novel is narrated by Joseph D'Souza from London, where he is exiled. It explores the colonial history of the Goans and their exploits under Portuguese and British colonialists, and how this shaped their orientation towards nation building. The novel is set largely in Namibia, Nazareth's fictional name for Uganda, with a cyclic plot which ends as it begins with the assassination attempt on Robert Cheyenne, the first post-independence prime minister. Robert Cheyenne is a figure that is constructed after Milton Obote, who is also the person who leads the country to independence. And there was also an assassination attempt against him. Constructed as a fictional memoir, the novel chronicles the narrator's confession of his involvement in the political corruption and a nation-building process that has taken a wrong turn. As with the general presence of the Goans in the country, the political corruption and ineptitude, an atmosphere of mutual suspicion between the Goans and Africans, is constructed as a post-colonial condition. The novel's takes stock of what it means for Goans to inhabit a post-independent, heterogeneous Namibia, relating without excusing the history of their relationship with British colonialism, while emphasizing that the loyalty that a majority of them expressed towards the British Empire is tempered by notable cases of corruption in anti-colonial nationalism. Narrated nearly 20 years later, the Gani sack echoes similar concerns. The novel amplifies the theme of mobility in the Western Indian Ocean and Asians' later dispersion to imperial metropolises as post-independence political backlashes. Like Nazareth, Vasanji construct Asians' experience in East Africa. Well, as I've already said that. The novel is narrated from Boston in the United States, where the narrator, Salim Juma, the great-grandson of the first-generation patriarch, Danji Govinji, is exiled. Like in a brown mantle, it constructs the West as the preferred migration destination for Asians. Despite Asians' long sojourns in East Africa, which in many cases become permanent settlements, the region has in Nazareth's novel doubled simply as a connecting node on a complex migratory trajectory that begins from Jaunpur in India in the 1880s. A member of the Shamshis, a fictitious esoteric sect of Islam, Danji leaves Jaunpur, the ancestral birthplace of the sect, as part of a more complicated exodus following the communities, the internal conflict that embroiled the communities, resulting from its establishment almost 3 centuries earlier. His choice of destination, as with the rest of the Shamshis, is not accidental, for the sect is founded on a prophecy that the sun would one day rise from the west, with a promise that they should await a savior. The novel constructs the westward journey partly as a spiritual quest for the long-awaited savior, who 3 centuries later is yet to arrive, and partly as motivated by material quest. A similar motif runs through America. America is a novel also by Vasanji, published a year after the Ghani sack, where Ramji, the narrator, at the beginning of the novel recalls that his ancestors were instructed to await the final avatar of their god, Vishnu, whose arrival, as in the Ghani sack, would be heralded by the sun rising from the west and setting in the east. The novel is similarly preoccupied with locating the West. Ramji observes, "My people sought it first in Africa, an ocean away, where they settled. But in time, the West moved further and became America, or as grandmas say, America." As in the Ghani sack, the mythical element in the operation of memory is attended by material considerations, transforming this religious quest into an economic one. In the postcolonial climate in which Nazareth and Vasanji are writing, the desire for and the quest for national belonging and Afro-Asian engagements are shaped by 2 interrelated ideological pursuits. One is local and the other is global, which were pursued by the post-independence governments in Tanzania and Uganda shortly after independence. The local one comprised programs of economic nationalism, which in Uganda becomes popularly known as Africanization, designed largely to mitigate Asian stronghold on the economy. And the global one was an offshoot of the loose anti-imperial Third World Alliance, born out of the 1955 Bandung Conference, which in each of the 2 countries involved a move to the left. The 2 ideological pursuits are articulated in Arusha Declaration in 1967 and the Common Man's Charter in 1969. Arusha Declaration is Tanzania, the Common Man's Charter in Uganda, which the immediate post-independence government in Tanzania and Uganda respectively passed to present to their citizenry popular versions of socialism as a vital initial first step towards actualization of the full meaning of independence and the realization of national ideals. Both documents identify feudalism and capitalism as twin evils that endanger the new nation states. To isolate them, the Tanzanian government, under its ruling party, the Tanganyika African National Congress, TANU, restricted its membership to peasants and workers. Similarly, the register of the Common Man's Charter, passed by the Uganda's ruling party, the Uganda People's Congress, hinges on the notion of the common man, preventing effectively, as stated in Article 3 of the Charter, quote, "any person or group of persons from being masters of all or a section of the people of Uganda, and to ensure that all citizens of Uganda become truly masters of their own destinies." These 2 documents deal with slightly different political threats. In Tanzania, which is already a republic, the threat is primarily from the capitalists. In Uganda, it is from both feudalists and capitalists, though the former present a more urgent threat. Indeed, the passing of the charter follows the 1966 Kabaka crisis, the first coup d'etat that deposes the country's first ceremonial president, who is also the Kabaka of Buganda, and ushers in republicanism after the abolition of monarchies, culminating with the promulgation of the 1967 Republican Constitution. In Uganda, more so than in Tanzania, the rhetorical force of the common man, defined primarily against the feudalists, rests in its capacity to conflate feudalists and capitalists as enemies of the new state. In both countries, capitalists are predominantly Asians. Each of the 2 documents crystallizes the respective government's policy resolutions and articulates proposal for national service. The so-called Asian exodus of the 1960s, which culminated in the 1972 expulsion, is mainly fueled by these ideological pursuits. And it's mainly these ideological pursuits that make East Africa more unhomely to the Asians, leading to their onward migration from the region as they seek for better locations. In my reading, I draw attention to these political developments and the tensions that they generate as motivating impulses in the 2 novels. In fact, a closer narrative analysis of the novels reveal how they are making an attempt to respond to, and in some instances actually dramatize, the ensuing tensions. I want to say something about the engagements, and I will try to skip through in the interest of time. The engagements between Asians and East Africa, East Africans. The two novels reveal that ideological and cultural differences between Asians and Africans jeopardize Afro-Asian engagements, complicating the diaspora's entry into the post-independence nations. These complications are constructed as post-colonial conditions, originating largely from the hurried transference and imposition of a European mode of nationalism based on the nation state upon varied, often rival, arbitrarily clustered ethnicities, posing serious challenges to the process of nation building and national integration. The integration of these different ethnicities into a cohesive nation is compounded by the very nature of British colonial projects in Uganda and Tanganyika. Derek Wright points out that, unlike in settler colonies, e.g. Kenya, Southern Rhodesia, South Africa, where land alienation forged a common bond between the masses and the elite, in the protectorates, such as in Uganda, and trusteeship, such as Tanganyika, where where colonial Britain assumed responsibility of the defeated German colonial possessions, there was little to unite the various classes and ethnicities into a concerted anti-colonial alliance. In such colonial holdings, the elite were simply groomed and co-opted into the political systems to continue from where the colonialists had left off at independence. Besides, the British colonialists in Uganda and Tanganyika recruited the Asians to fill the middleman's role, resulting in the latter's eventual domination of the economic sector. The absence of any systematic overhaul of the colonial superstructure at independence intensifies the pressure on the new elite to demonstrate to the masses the substance of political independence. The process of decolonization, which for both Uganda and Tanzanian governments ostensibly continued beyond political independence, intensifies mutual suspicion between Asians and East African political elite. For one thing, association with British colonialism and uncertain affiliation with the nation state limits Asians' political presence in the moment of nation building. For another, the socialist proclivity of the immediate post-independence governments in both Uganda and Tanzania and the nationalization programs that they pursued put the Asians and their businesses on the receiving end of anti-capitalist and populist ideologies. Capturing this tension, D'Souza, that is the narrator of In a Brown Mantle, observes, and I quote, "Whereas the Asians were non-existent politically, physically they were all too real. They were the custom and immigration officials, the desk clerks and managers, the shopkeepers, the landlords, etc., etc. And Namibia was supposed to be an African country. There were African businesses, but they were invisible. Our task then is speaking as an anti-colonial, as a immediate post-colonial statesman. Our task then, our being the ruling party to which he belongs, our task then was to turn towns of Namibia into visible African areas, only speckled with Asians and Europeans. So many Asian businesses were dispossessed by making it mandatory that only citizens ran businesses. Their businesses were usually bought up at low prices by Africans, often relatives of my colleagues in the party, that is. What D'Souza captures here, even though he doesn't explicitly uses the term, is the practice of Africanization, designed to wrest the economy from the foreign influence and manipulations and simultaneously empower Africans. Historically, Africanization pursuits combined the new nation's vision of a leftist post-war third world politics and its effort to fortify itself against the forces of global imperialism by dismantling local structures of capitalism. Nazareth's conspicuous silence on the ideological impulse behind this nationalization drives is significant. For the Common Man's Charter that legalizes dispossession of Asian property is adopted as an ideological pursuit and legal instrument of the Obote One, or Cheyenne. Cheyenne is the fictional character named after Obote One. Just a year before the novel's publication, Nazareth evades engaging with the ideological underpinnings of Africanization as part of the new nation's decolonization process. Such textual silence opens him up to criticism for oversimplifying Afro-Asian tensions in Namibia. It needs to be highlighted here that the overlap between Obote and Cheyenne, as that between Namibia and Uganda, is of course inexact. But it would be a misreading to ignore the parallels between the historical and its fictional representation. For the mappings, as the novel's strategy for censuring with impunity, carry artistic import. The arbitrary discrepancy between the two levels of representation thus militate against the artistic merit of the novel and its capacity to illuminate Namibian, that is Ugandan, social structures. Similar to this is a selective representation that tells a deliberately incomplete story. For instance, the novel, in foregrounding Afro-Asian tensions, silences ethnic tensions that were historically even stronger. The implementation of the Common Man's Charter, for instance, targeted the feudalists, that is the monarchists, more than the capitalists, that is Asians, and the abolition of kingdoms and appropriation and occupation of their property as a strategy against the feudalists during the 1966 Kabaka crisis was more ruthless than the controlled nationalization programs, at least in the phase during the Obote One regime, before Amin radicalized it. A more complex narrative of these events, a more complex narrative of this period would put in perspective the racial and ethnic tensions that characterize the immediate post-independence period, both resulting from the ideological pursuits of Obote One government in the name of decolonization and nation building. Nazareth's narrator D'Souza instead amplifies the ideological bankruptcy of Namibia's new political elite. Namibia's independence movement for him was, quote, mainly a revolution one shouted or drank one's way into, unquote. Excusing his own ineptitude on grounds of marginality, even though Nazareth himself, in contrasting him with Pius Kota. Pius Kota is a Goan nationalist from Mosaki, Azingwe, which is Nazareth's fictional code for Nairobi, Kenya. So Nazareth, in contrasting his narrator with Pius Kota, suggests that his naivety stems from the same ideological bankruptcy that he criticizes in the African political elite. D'Souza castigates Cheyenne for being so involved, quote, in the immediate future, unquote, to such a degree that he neglects the distant future. Echoing D'Souza, Wright identifies the greatest obstacle to African postcolonial progress and the failure of nation building as the lack of any framing national ideology beyond the hosting of colonialists. African nationalism, he contends, was primarily, quote, primarily a struggle against colonialism, not a movement for or towards anything. And its proponents had a better idea of what they wanted to remove than what they wanted to replace it with. Few of the new leaders thought beyond the moment of independence to the kind of states that they were creating, or evolved any original idea or direction for their construction, unquote. Drawing such inferences from D'Souza's perspective results in a superficial reading, for Nazareth's novel consciously strive to reveal the narrator's unreliability. The novel suggests that D'Souza's own corruptibility, ideological bankruptcy, and sensuousness disqualify him from critiquing similar flaws in his African counterparts. By African, I mean black counterparts, members of the party. D'Souza believes that these flaws in himself emanates from the influence of Namibia's unscrupulous political elite, against whom he is powerless. His figure thus functions simply as part of the novel's elaborate masking device, licensing the author to censure Namibia's political system and inept political elite that produced and mentored him. How much time do I have?
About 10 minutes.
Okay. Nazareth represents Kota, not D'Souza, as his mouthpiece and a model nationalist. Unsurprisingly, Kota's assessment of Namibia's political realities differs significantly from that of D'Souza, stemming as it does from a down-to-earth politics, which, contrary to the empty theorizing that characterizes the latter's, engages with the lived experiences of the dispossessed masses. Kota dismisses D'Souza and with him the rest of the Namibian political elite for having learned all his, quote, left-wing talk from left-wing English country clubs, unquote. D'Souza's experience of society, Kota highlights, is petty bourgeois Goan society. The novel accounts for this anomaly in D'Souza in terms of his having been nurtured in Namibia, a protectorate, where anti-colonial nationalism was not as exacting as in a settler colony such as Azingwe, where Kota comes from. It is thus through Kota that Nazareth touches on the class dimensions and social politics that define Afro-Asian relations in Namibia. Kota nonetheless remains a minor character in the novel, and class, politics, and economic independence, as critical issues of the day, even though hinted at, remains largely unexplored. Kota also remains the only positive check on D'Souza's incongruities. Thus, the novel reeks of ambiguities and reads as a rushed project of satirical excoriation, owing to the unclear boundaries between the narrator's unreliability and the author's own stance. This slippage, for instance, manifests itself in the colonialist mindset with which D'Souza analyzes Namibia's post-colonial condition. The corruption and ineptitude that cripples Namibia bears its overtones. It is not only that D'Souza himself succumbs to the very vices for which he falls, the political elite, the black political elite, while speculating that such flaws are innately African, but that Nazareth himself seems unconscious of his narrator's incongruities. This makes the novel read like a failed attempt at satirical excoriation. The model of Afro-Asian engagement and vision in the post-colonial moment draws on the same stereotypical contrast between Africans and Goans or Asians that colonialism promoted. In keeping with the colonial logic that constructed Africans as a people who were incapable of managing their own affairs, D'Souza diagnoses the problem with Namibian civil service as resulting from the departure of European colonialists, and especially their replacement by Africans. Unfortunately, the new bureaucrats, quote, thought like the British, or they did not think at all, unquote. The Goans, in contrast, quote, were faithful and efficient civil servants, but they merely executed policy and did not make it, and they were too few, unquote. Implicit here is the need for the Goans to assume the burden relinquished by the colonialists, thus nullifying the very essence of political independence, as most Goans still perceive Africans as a people incapable of self-determination. The African political elite, for their part, are equally prejudiced against the Goans, largely on historical grounds. Resorting to the same practice of racial stereotyping and homogenizing perfected under colonialism, to reinforce the anti-Goan rhetoric, anti-colonial nationalism is represented as ill-prepared to dismantle the racial prejudice established as an immutable colonial order. The process of nation-building thus failed to transcend Afro-Asian racial divide and produce a far-reaching cross-racial engagement, since whatever little attempt to that effect remains on the personal level. Asianness is perceived to be essentially anti-nationalism, and full assimilation is the only terms on which the diaspora can be co-opted. Cheyenne presents Yosefu. His name is Joseph, but Cheyenne insists on calling him Yosefu, which is in local parlance for Joseph. Cheyenne presents Yosefu D'Souza to the people as, quote, a brown man outside but he is all black inside, unquote. One who is different from, quote, his brothers, the Muhindis, who have forgotten the cruelty of the white man and now work with them to hurt us. The brotherhood that is forged with D'Souza, if opportunistically, is anchored on Goan 400 years of domination under Portuguese colonial rule. While Africanization tags such as Yosefu, Mugoa is the term for Goa in Uganda, and Muhindis for Indian, as John Schechter maintains, may represent the inadequacy of Goanness or Indianness to explain Nazareth's characters, and as such regularize their solid, visible presence in East Africa. The failure of these new identities to attain any political significance is inescapable. Schechter contends that such tags seek to strengthen Asians' identification as Africans by, quote, by demolishing their own claims to exclusivity, unquote. This argument, however, ignores the fact that these tags are imposed by Africans and not necessarily claimed by Goans or Asians themselves. As such, they are rather statements of Africans' desire to undo Goan or Asian identities through assimilation. In the novel, such assimilationist initiatives, or at least co-option into the cause of nationalism, and the ultimate project of inclusive post-independent citizenship, fails largely because neither Africans nor Goans are prepared to shake off the colonial hangover that shaped their perception of one another. Cheyone's brand of left-wing politics and populist maneuvers, for instance, exacerbate mutual suspicion. He attacks not just systems, but, quote, the races and the individuals who were part of those systems. He did not attack only exploitation, he attacked Asian exploitation. In the minds of most people, Cheyone was not only condemning exploitation, but Asians, unquote. Nazareth debunks the stereotype of Asians as an exploitative people, exclusively obsessed with commerce. But this endeavor is offset by a conscious effort in the novel to earmark a separate Goan identity, apparently to exclude Goans from the larger Asian communities, who has a lot of cultural baggage associated with their presence because of their participation in the economy. Both Cheyone and D'Souza are instrumental in distancing Goans from the involvement in the economy and the attendant charge of exploitation, typically associated with the wider Asian communities, by emphasizing their specialty in the civil service. For their part, Asians take on an anti-nationalist position, further complicating Afro-Asian relationship after political independence. Nationalist politics, as Thombani points out, represents a threat to their privileged position. Thus, in joining it, D'Souza, while strengthening his relationship with Africans, even if only in a limited way, thus alienates himself from his fellow Goans or Asians. D'Souza's investment in the cause of nationalism thus seems insufficient to confer upon him the legitimacy he seeks. Towards the end of the novel, his closing farewell, quote, "Goodbye, Mother Africa. Your bastard son loved you." As his exile-bound plane takes off, underlies his illegitimacy. His self-reference as a bastard, as Schechter observes, valorizes filiation at the expense of affiliation. In his absence, D'Souza becomes a liability to his people, his political pursuits having gone terribly wrong. The Namibian political elite single him out, quote, as a hammer to knock down other Asians, unquote. His fallout with Namibian political elite emerges as a minor key in the failed attempt at assimilating Asians. It is a foretaste of the fate that would befall the diaspora on the altar of political expedience. The accuracy with which Nazareth predicts both the coup against Cheyone and the expulsion of Asians emerges as one of the strongest and most redeeming features of the narrative, its structural weaknesses notwithstanding. Part of Nazareth's oversight is to imagine and project the exilic condition that produces the narrative, even though the actual writing of the novel takes place in Uganda. So there's interesting things I would have loved to say about Vasanjis, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to the conclusion. I conclude that the two novels show that diaspora consciousness for Asians, rather than mitigating their unhomely conditions, does more to exacerbate them, thereby complicating their desire for national belonging in the post-independence moment. In the two novels, the diasporic subject describe their marginality by situating themselves uneasily between British colonialists and Africans, and in the post-independence moment between their respective communities and African cultures that seek to assimilate them. In the post-independence dispensation, the politics that the diaspora subjects espouse is contingent upon how they define their destiny and negotiate their affiliations. As one of the motivating factors behind the two novels, questions of belonging and citizenship are shown to drive a wedge between Africans and Asians. Both Nazareth and Vasanji, however, evince a keen awareness of the point highlighted by Godwin Siundu, that invoking history does more to undermine, invoking history as part of the practice of diaspora identity, does more to undermine than strengthen Asians' claim to East African countries as home. Siundu accounts for this difficulty in terms of Asians' association with or participation in the entrenchment of British colonialism in the region. On the one hand, and the autochthonous claims of home. Let me restate that. Both Nazareth and Vasanji evince a keen awareness of the point made by Siundu that invoking history does more to undermine than strengthen Asians' claim to East African countries as home. Siundu accounts for this difficulty in terms of Asians' association with or participation in the entrenchment of British colonialism in the region on the one hand, and the autochthonous claims of the home national people, made especially by the political elite in the post-independence period, on the other. Nazareth and Vasanji's novels, without denying this role, seek to complicate Asians' contribution to the emergence of the nation-state in the regions, including their often overlooked participation in anti-colonial politics. Actually, in the case of Uganda, the very first speaker of the national parliament was Asian, and so it's a figure that D'Souza is kind of constructed after. D'Souza is a very central part of the cabinet in the first ruling government. So this participation is used as a basis for asserting belonging and claiming legitimacy and citizenship right. For both Nazareth and Vasanji, however, attempts to highlight Asian contributions to anti-colonial nationalism and nation building repeatedly returns to the tension generated by the contending aspirations of African Asians, which, coupled with the burdens of history that the latter have to carry, galvanize a strong wave of Asian exodus in the late 1960s and early 1970s, culminating in the 1972 expulsion of Asians from Uganda. In the two novels, Nazareth more so than Vasanji's, Asians' victimization in the wake of the immediate post-independence nationalist fervor stem less from the popular perception against them as the most prominent vestiges of imperialism than from the diaspora's failure to adjust to the demands and pressures of post-independence dispensation. In the climate of the ideological jostling of the late 1960s and the pressures to actualize the full meaning of independence, Asians emerge as the most convenient target to the new political elite. The resultant exodus, thus, while signaling Asians' failure to assert belonging, opens new possibilities that had been stifled by East African nationalists and the whole diaspora. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Now it's time for us to interact and ask questions, comment. We have the microphone here. Those of you who attend regularly know this. Not for amplification. We don't need amplification in this room, but because it's part of the recording, and so we need this so that your voice is recorded. So I'll walk this around. If anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ocita, for such a wonderful presentation. I'm a big fan of Stellenbosch University. I work in cultural heritage and work closely with the Stellenbosch University Museum. And my name is You spoke a lot about nation building, so I want to know, how are you defining nation building for the Indian diaspora in South African East Africa? Would you say that it's similar to people who are born in these particular countries, or would you say there's a difference? Thank you.
Should I?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Thinking of nation building as a foil against which I make sense of diaspora identity. Of course, nation building, the ideals of nation building is in direct competition with the pressure to preserve a separate cultural identity. The identities of the nation and the desire for cultural identity for the diaspora are actually moving in opposite direction. So I'm situating the performance of cultural identity of the diaspora against as responses to the pressures, assimilationist pressures exerted by nationalist, discourses. And particularly, nation building by its very nature basically seeks to assimilate anomalous groups, in this case the diaspora, and in the process erase their cultural identity, their cultural specificity. It's specifically that desire by nationalist ideologues to assimilate the diaspora and in the process erase their difference that these narratives are told to resist. So I'm not conflating the two. I'm rather thinking of the nation building initiatives as something that, as a threat that writers of the Asian diaspora in East Africa are trying to respond to. So in a sense, actually, their narratives are part of the attempts to preserve a separate cultural identity, which goes against, the ideals of nation building. I mean, of course, there may be positive ways of participating in post-independence politics without necessarily sacrificing one's cultural identity, such as, for instance, D'Souza is caught up in. But we also see the limitation of that. And instead of D'Souza's example becoming, something that is representative, it's actually highly personal. It's operating at a highly personal level. And towards the end of the narrative, it definitely fails. So yeah, so that is the sense in which I'm reading nationalist, nation building and anti-colonial struggles and all these kind of things. There are pressures against which the performance of Asian identity, repeatedly finds itself confronted with. Yeah.
I'll ask a follow-up to Tiffany's question then. You spent most of your presentation on the East African novel,
Yeah.
and I understand because of time-wise, but
Yeah.
you set up this bifurcation between settler and you call trustee in the case, our more traditional colonialism. This impacted obviously both the colonial experience of the indigenous people as well as diaspora communities that came in. In terms of your response to this tension between preserving cultural identity and also national identity, embracing nationalism and national identity, how does this differ between those two experiences? So does the East African experience, is it more difficult to negotiate that because of the colonial experience than it is in South Africa, as seen in these two novels?
Yeah. Well, actually, the focus of this novel is squarely on East Africa. But in my wider work, because I make an attempt at comparison, I look at the South African experience. Mahmoud Mamdani has actually made an attempt to make that distinction between the way in which the nature of colonial governmentality in colonies such as Kenya, South Africa, Rhodesia, Algeria, and so on and so forth, differ from that in protectorates or trusteeships. Now, the point Mabnani is making is that in settler colonies, the middleman role which Asians occupy in East Africa was occupied by settlers from white settler countries, okay? In this case, England, Scotland, and so on and so forth, whites. So what that then means is that Africans found themselves with a clear choice in the anti-colonial, or in the case of South Africa, anti-apartheid struggle, because the forces against which they were pitted was clearer. And so in the anti-colonial struggle, Africans, black Africans, and Indians often found themselves on the same side, struggling against imperialism. Now, that contrasts with, of course, there are limitations to that example, which I'm not going to get into, but that contrasts in general terms with the situation in East Africa, where the British colonialists, or let me say the whites generally, occupied the top most part of the economic activity, particularly in banking, insurance, and hospitality, and so on and so forth, leaving the middleman role, the economy, like especially industry and so on and so forth, to Indians. So it's Indians who have to engage with the Africans as employers, as people they interact with. So Indians therefore function in this setting as a buffer between the whites and the blacks. So any hostility emanating from colonial economy, from colonial governmentality, touches less the white colonialists, but the Indian. So it's the Indian who is seen as the devil, as the devils, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to anti-colonial struggle, Indians are looked at as actually maybe even more visible form of, the most immediate target. Actually, you see, in South Africa, again, to complicate the kind of complication that I said I'm not going to, we also have something similar to that, especially with regard to the Durban riots and so on and so forth. Durban is a unique situation because in Durban, Indians are more like what they feel the kind of role that they have in East Africa and so on and so forth. So when these kind of tensions boil to the surface, the colonialists, the white colonialists, in most cases tend to step in as an arbiter, the good cop. So the bad cop is the Indian. So in terms of interracial engagement, which is the ideal sought after in the post-independence period, post-independence period, these kind of engagements, these kind of meaningful engagements as a necessary part of inhabiting the post-independence moment, breaks down miserably, especially in Uganda and in Tanzania, and to a large degree in Kenya too, even though Kenya is a colony, but that's a complication I will not get into. So up to now, up to the present, even, so many years after the expulsion, the level of interracial hostility, to the degree that racism exists in these kind of countries, has Asians more than the white at the receiving end. So that was because of a very careful racial card that was played by the British colonialists. It was a deliberate process, placing Indians in this role as a buffer between the whites, the Europeans and the Africans. Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to say with regard to socialization, which contrasts with South Africa, and in South Africa, Indians were largely, a big number of them were in plantation economy. So a number of them, of course, prospered, but socialization through the plantation afforded a better pattern of engagement with the local than socialization through other economic activities, and so on and so forth. In other words, they were closer to the soil, literally, closer to the people. So in South Africa, you find participation in anti-apartheid struggle or any kind of anti-imperial protest much stronger, and normally pitting Asians and Africans alongside each other. The presence of Indians in South Africa and cultural spaces in South Africa is much more pronounced than in East Africa. So in East Africa, that wall, so many years after the expulsion, so many years after the return of expropriated property, is still there. So there is this, Mamdani suggests these two questions, the old question and the new questions, as ways of understanding, this kind of engagements. And the all Asian question had to do with how Asians could function in, under colonialism, and where racism was blatant. The new Asian question has to do with Asians inhabiting a non-racialized city, but yet having very little to do with, having very little cultural engagements with their host national people, and so on and so forth. So how does one account for this, and so on and so forth? It's still an unanswered question. It's still a question that is waiting to be answered, and so on and so forth. So it's a complex thing, which actually I think go beyond just, looking at that divide between the colony and protectorates.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Another important construct, especially in South Africa, was the separation of communities, the separation of Indians from the broader community. Was there some similarities with that in East Africa, and does that have a dynamic, or does it play within the politics of apartheid, separation of communities, and this notion of cultural identity and nationalism?
The separation in East Africa is, during colonial times there was, it was legalized, but not as ruthlessly as in South Africa. But besides that legalization, there is also the insularity of Asian communities themselves. So even without any kind of legal framework, their socialization is normally inclined towards, social inclusivity. In South Africa, what I could say, very quickly, is that especially after the 1960s, there's this black consciousness movement, which, as a protest against apartheid racial taxonomies, had the disenfranchised people coming up with, adopting a unifying black identity. So blackness in the anti-apartheid struggle emerges not as a designator of race, but as a category that allowed one to assert one's right to self-determination. So again, that is something that is very unique from the East African context. So in East Africa, Asians tend to be accused not just by their black counterparts, but also by writers, especially in the works that I'm describing as post-1990 works narrated from especially the UK. We have a very scathing attack of Asian communities by Asian writers. Their collusion in colonialism, their perpetration of racism, and so on and so forth. So narratives such as this avail a platform where we can interrogate those kind of issues. I don't know whether that answers you. Yeah.
My question was, from what I know, there were so many intellectuals in East Africa, in particular of Indian descent, that really were forerunners for the socialist movement, all those socialist theoretic scholars. So, and I was wondering, always wondering, and you talked a bit about it maybe, but was it more like, would you talk about it as a rupture in the Indian community, like those which really supported the socialist, maybe Pan-African idea even, and those upholding the Indian identity? Is that also something that's kind of negotiated in literature, or I don't know whether you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, yes, even starting with politics actually, because the focus in these novels is more on in the political space. So both historically, but also in terms of the way it's represented in literature, there were Indian presence. So it's not as if their presence in East Africa was all about tinkering with the economy and so on and so forth. But also on cultural fronts, there have been quite a number of the founder of Transition is currently in Harvard. The founder of Transition, Rajat Niyogi. Transition was one of the most vocal, most vibrant publications that emerged in the 60s, immediately after independence. So Transition afforded a platform not just for Uganda, but for intellectuals across the continent, and actually across the diaspora, the African diaspora, to engage in very vibrant debates on issues that were affecting Africa and black people at the time. And I don't know what Transition at the moment is involved in, but I think it's a legacy of the time that we are talking about. It's a legacy of the intellectual energy that Asians bequeathed to the continent. In South Africa, there was Gandhi, and was running was having a printing press, and the Indian Opinion. The Indian Opinion was focused more at anti-colonial nationalism in India, but still, of course, it was also involved in the local issues of racial segregation in South Africa and so on and so forth. So yes, Indians have been very vocal in cultural production. At the moment, one of the writers that I deal with is Shelja Patel. Shelja Patel is engaged in a one-woman's performance poetry. And again, she's bringing issues of concern to Indians at the forefront of public debate and so on and so forth. Our most recognizable work is Migritude, which is basically about what it means for a post-colonial subject to move from a post-colony to a white metropolitan space. She looks at UK, she looks at US, yes, specifically those two. So, those are debates that are in very, very interesting ways shaped by Indians, and therefore a legacy of their, what you could think of as, participation in the kind of debates that nationalist ideologues are interested in. Very exciting.
Well, again, thank you very, very much, and we wish you the very best as hopefully your manuscript will soon be published.
Yeah.
And we look forward to reading it. And again, thank you very much for making the trek from Atlanta here, and safe travels home to Uganda tomorrow.
Thank you for the audience.
Thank you. Thank you all.